Welcome to today's EUROMED Migration Talk. Today we are accompanied by Natalia Banulescu-Bogdan, Associate Director of the Migration Policy Institute's International Program. Natalia, thank you so much for being with us today. Joining us from Washington, isn't it?
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Let's dive right in. So in your recent interventions and work, I can see some consistent work about the migration narrative. And my first question that is very important for us is to understand one particular aspect of this narrative in the Euro-Mediterranean region. So if you think about 2015, when the migration crisis, so-called, hit Europe, we can see how this narrative has been strongly polarized in this region. Now, do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic has actually reinforced this polarization? And if so, how has it done so?
Sure, I do actually. I think we all have a basic human need to try to make sense of the world around us. And the way this pandemic has unfolded, making sense of the world has been very connected to the idea of an outside threat coming in, the crisis in the middle toward the end. And that level of uncertainty is very destabilizing to people. And it's, also in contrast to a natural disaster, for instance, which is sort of nobody's fault. But the spread of communicable disease has a long history of being blamed on specific groups and being blamed on foreigners in particular.
However, something interesting that happened during this pandemic is that the role of migrant workers, especially in key sectors of the economy in Europe and along the Mediterranean, has been very relevant. Do you think that reporting on these cases, on these efforts, has actually contributed to nurturing a less polarized debate on migration, or has it had the opposite effect? What are your findings on this?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I do think that the words we use matter. When we're steeped in an environment where the only time we hear about migrants, it's in the frame of either being a victim or a criminal, that filters down into our subconscious and affects our attitudes toward immigration in general. So I think it's very tempting to try to change this narrative by introducing a new frame, a third frame, that of immigrants as contributors. But I think if you're talking about changing minds, it's a very difficult thing to do. So for people who are already predisposed to feeling threatened by migrants, by newcomers, by change, when you single out certain communities, even if you're doing so in order to elevate their contributions, you're reinforcing difference, just de facto. And so once you've created this us versus them dichotomy, I think it's not that easily walked back, and it can be kind of weaponized in the other direction should circumstances shift.
If you think about, rising public anxiety about migration has manifested in numerous ways. Now, according to your expertise, what are the main factors then fueling this public unease, and what strategies would you then suggest to policymakers to address these concerns that you've just mentioned in your previous response?
Well, as you've alluded to, anxiety about immigration is never just about one thing, right? It usually latches on to pre-existing feelings of insecurity, whether these are feelings of economic insecurity or cultural insecurity. And it's also important to note that we're talking about relative insecurity. And so you'll never be able to find a correlation between spikes in anti-immigration sentiment and economic hardship, or even levels of immigration. These things don't perfectly correlate. It's much more subtle and complex than that. And it's not necessarily organic. These things can be activated or deactivated. They can be made more or less salient, depending on how politicians and community leaders choose to communicate and how they choose to frame the changes that people are experiencing. And I think this is especially true in times of immigration shocks or rapid change. So related to your question of what we can do, when we do have these big upheavals in our lives, leadership is extremely important. Public anxiety is not set in stone. It's actually quite responsive to external cues. And so I think, leaders in the community, whether at the national, local, international level, you have some choices to make. You can engage head on with people's anxieties, the changes that immigration brings, rather than pretending that there are no changes or that these don't need to be discussed. We need to create room for people to voice their legitimate fears and concerns rather than making these taboo.
Emotions versus facts dichotomy, which is not just about migration. I think it has been around the communication debate, the post-truth debate for quite some times now. If we think about emotionally charged and anecdotal narratives about migration, they often seem to drown out arguments made on the basis of robust data and evidence. Now, what can be done to address the gap between what research has shown about migration trends and what the public believes? I mean, can we actually bridge that gap?
This is a very tricky issue, and it's not, as you've alluded to, just limited to migration. It's hard to talk about contentious policy issues across the board. And one of the problems is about how our brains are wired. Our brains are actually hardwired to resist new information. Information consumption is really a personal phenomenon. We kind of assume that people are a blank slate, just waiting to be filled with these facts that we've prepared. And all we have to do is supply them with the correct information. But I would argue that they're not. Again, it's this personal connection. People are generally seeking affirmation. So we start with our desired conclusion and ignore or discount anything that doesn't fit this frame. And once strong beliefs are in place, they're very, very difficult to dislodge, particularly when they're connected to identity, people's sense of where they fit in the world and how they define themselves, particularly vis-a-vis other groups. And the changes that we've seen in the media landscape have exacerbated this. It's never been easier to avoid views different from our own, to question experts, even to fabricate news or facts that confirms our prior beliefs. So I think the biggest lesson there for me is we can't just focus on supplying the information that we want to put out there and just drop information into the environment without accounting for how it is received. And I also want to add another sort of reflection to this, which is, when you're asking about kind of bridging facts and evidence with what people believe, I think we also have to understand that there aren't really objective facts about migration the way that we want there to be. And I hate to say this as someone whose career is literally about analyzing facts about migration, but we have to accept that people experience migration personally at an individual level, and it doesn't hold benefits for all people at all times.
If we look at different narratives, so if you look at the migration narratives in different parts of the world, do you see more differences or more similarities? Like, is the EUROMED region quite specific, or do you think that somehow there are some phenomena that repeat themselves regardless of their geographical origin?
Yeah, I do think that there are patterns that we see repeated across regions. And what matters very much is what types of migration flows we're talking about, and particularly whether they're expected or unexpected. So unexpected flows, things that contradict what publics have been told by their governments to expect, things that contradict promises that politicians have made, can be very destabilizing, very disorienting, and can catalyze these knee-jerk responses where people are searching for solutions. People are searching for something that they can do in the face of this loss of control. And so when we're talking about irregular migration flows, whether across the Mediterranean or across the United States southern border, you have these similar narrative patterns that get engaged. And so, what can we do? Again, I think often we're trying to sort of correct what people already believe. And I think that sometimes leads us down the wrong path, because the jump between people accepting new information that you tell them and actually changing their attitudes can be actually more of a chasm. So, for example, you gave the example earlier of talking about immigrants as essential workers right now in the COVID response. But even if you can persuade people that one refugee doctor made a positive contribution, they might accept this as a one-time anecdote that you've told them, but they might not rewrite the story that they already have in their head based on this new piece of information. Again, I think our brains are very clever in that way, in terms of our ability to sort of bend around any new piece of information and slot it into the story that we already have prepared, rather than actually changing our minds. And so, I guess I have a couple of cautions or lessons. One is to try not to use overly positive messages. Again, people don't always experience migration as a solely beneficial event in their lives. We have to accept that it does have some consequences in certain communities that can be hard for people to accept. So I think messages about migrant contributions that don't also acknowledge hardship may seem disingenuous, or kind of fall flat with people. The other thing is, I think it's important to think about the right messenger and not just the right message. So again, when we're trying to change people's minds, people are more likely to accept inconvenient information from a trusted source, and in particular from somebody who is not perceived as having something to gain. So in that way, governments might not always be the best intermediaries. And the last point is, I think it's important to try to create a shared story of solidarity. So not just telling people that immigration is good or bad in general or for moral reasons, but actually making a case for self-interest, for the health of the community as a whole, making a case that we're stronger together than apart.
When we talk about the narrative, sometimes it can be complicated to try and advocate why this matters. So do you think that a distorted narrative actually distorts policymaking, or is it vice versa? Is it distorted policymaking in this case, in the field of migration, that distorts the narrative? Where is the chicken and where is the egg?
That's a good question. And I think instead of thinking of it as a linear process where there's a cause and effect, I kind of think of it as an ecosystem where these things are constantly interacting and feeding into each other. So narratives can come from the top down, what people hear from their elected politicians, what they hear from the media, but they can also be bottom up. They can bubble up from community concerns over strained resources or overcrowded infrastructure, concerns that people are seeing in schools that don't seem unaddressed. And so there really is also this bottom up effect when people feel like their needs are not being taken into account by their elected leaders, if they feel that certain groups are being prioritized over others. these are all things that can activate anxiety at the community level.